Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today, Sharing Economy, the Upside of Disrupting Local Government. We thank you for taking time out of your schedule to join us and are excited to have you with us today. Our presentation will be about 30 to 35 minutes, followed by a Q&A period. Today, we're going to look at the market and statistics of the sharing economy to comprehend its size and scope. We'll then look at the pros and cons for citizens and how it's impacting local government agencies. Once we've had a good understanding of the effects of the sharing economy, we'll look at the tactics that are being used by local governments across the country and discuss the pros and cons of each tactic. We'll wrap up with a roadmap that jurisdictions can use to address the sharing economy in their area, and then have an open Q&A session to give everyone a chance to ask our subject matter expert questions. And speaking of subject matter experts, it is my honor to introduce Jonathan Gerth, Esquire and Avenu Vice President of Tax and Audit Services. Jonathan is a graduate of the Thomas Good Jones School of Law and brings over a decade of experience across diverse industries, including professional auditor, accountant, and attorney. As a former IRS agent and tax attorney, his expertise spans across areas of auditing and regulatory compliance, assessment and collection practices, and tax litigation. Jonathan oversees Avenu's Audit Division, a nationwide team of certified examiners and accountants. And in 2018, he was recognized by the Birmingham Business Journal as a top 40 under 40 professional. And me? My name is Corinne Aycock, and I'll be your moderator today. I work on the marketing team here at Avenu. And who is Avenu? Avenu provides revenue enhancement services to uncover and recover new sources of untapped revenue. And we deliver software that streamlines day-to-day operations. Avenu is solely dedicated to state and local governments, and to date, we have partnered with over 3,000 government agencies nationwide. Now on to our presentation. So what is the sharing economy? According to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, it's an economic activity that involves individuals buying or selling access to goods or services, usually on a temporary basis, and generally arranged online. In a nutshell, it's about access to goods and services versus ownership. Jonathan, welcome, and thank you for being here today. You know the ins and outs of the sharing economy. Can you please share your perspective on the market?
Yes, and thank you, Corinne, for the introduction, and thanks to all of you for taking time out of your day to join us for our webinar. Just to mention, I really do like the definition that Webster provided long ago for the shared economy, because it did envision how broad it could become. And, you know, although this industry has burgeoned into so many areas based upon the providing of technology to advance it, we're really going to focus in today on three primary sectors: shared mobility, shared goods, and shared spaces. And while in reality, these industries seem new because of the names that are listed here, these industries are actually as archaic as, you know, for the shared mobility sector, going back to cabs, car rentals, even carpooling was part of that industry. Shared goods, think back to the days of garage sales, consignment stores, things of that nature. Now you have technology that provides online platforms for them. For shared spaces, you used to have to use property management and leasing companies to obtain those services. Now, in the shared, you know, based upon the advancements in technology and online platforms and convenience of accessibility to these services, you have publicly traded companies such as Uber, Lyft. There are even other areas companies such as Blade, whereby you can share a ride on a helicopter from a tower in New York City to with others to fly to the Hamptons if you want to, for the uber rich, so to speak. For the online platforms, companies such as for shared goods, companies such as Amazon and eBay started out as merely a platform whereby people could list their property and sell them. Now you have these companies as publicly traded entities, and the richest man in the world is the owner of Amazon. You have food delivery services. Based upon the expansion in this industry, and it has impacted interstate commerce so much to the extent that in the post-Wayfarer era, we now have economic nexus laws in almost every state. You have marketplace facilitators, as they speak, which are those who actually list their items on these websites and sell their products via these websites based upon their name recognition. In the shared spaces industries, you have entities such as Airbnb, which is now the largest hotelier in the entire world and does not own a single property yet. However, just as Amazon is now making their own products and has their own brand name, I assume someday the day will come where Airbnb has their own hotels. You also have the VRBOs and the HomeAways, but this is not just in the private sector or the for private rentals. Companies such as Regis offer commercial space for temporary use, that provide startups and other people with opportunities to have a professional office without having to enter into a long-term lease. Now, as you can see, based upon a mere 6-year period, statistics from Pricewaterhouse and Forbes and other entities predicted that this industry, the amount of users in this industry from 2016 to 21 is anticipated to grow from 44 million to almost double that, to 86.5 million people. And that is not due to an increase in population by any means, but rather availability and convenience of the services that are offered, and the expansion of new industries and areas and governmental allowance of these.
And that is certainly year-over-year growth that most companies would love to have. How large is the market in terms of dollars?
Well, this again is based upon studies by Forbes and PricewaterhouseCoopers and predictions for future growth. This industry is primarily driven by advancements in technology and, of course, what motivates innovation and creativity and the expansion and growth of most industries is always going to be money and profit. So never underestimate the power of money and profit to stimulate such activities. And it is anticipated that this company this industry from 2015 to 2025 could grow from $15 billion annually to $335 billion, which is going to attract a lot of new entrepreneurs. And a lot of these companies are now becoming publicly traded. I mean, there's areas in this industry that were at one point likely never imaginable. Things like, I've been to a website called BoatSetter, whereby you can actually peer-to-peer rent someone's private boat, captain optional, and go on a boat ride. I mean, I don't even want to get into the potential insurance liability in that industry, but they have a very nice website.
Well, it certainly seems to be a fast-moving and growing trend. Now that we've got a general understanding of the scope and size of the market, let's transition and talk about both the pros and cons of how it's affecting citizens. Jonathan, can you start by sharing some of the positive impacts that its sharing economy is having with the audience?
Absolutely. Obviously, the sharing economy would not be expanding so vastly worldwide were it not providing customers, citizens, communities with positive impact. And some of these, just to name a few, are, increased access to services. I mean, for the ability to obtain a ride share, or, a transportation, for those, particularly for those who are disabled, elderly, or simply don't have another means of transportation. It provides access to vacations for cheaper rentals that may not have happened otherwise, that people may not have been able to afford to go on. It gives people convenient choices. I mean, for things such as groceries being delivered to your house if you live in a rural area, or if you just don't feel like getting out that day. If you want your lunch delivered to you in the office on a rainy day and where you don't want to get out, entities like DoorDash and Uber Eats can now deliver that to your desk. It provides office space for startup companies that can't afford to otherwise have professional environments in which to operate. It led to a reduced amount of consumer costs for access to some of these services based upon competition. The cab industry is, always notoriously been rather expensive compared to the ride-sharing industry. VRBO, Airbnb, entities like that offer oftentimes much cheaper prices to rent a place to stay than do commercial property rental companies or bookings through an actual hotel. It's provided increased income producing opportunities for those who are seeking supplemental income, or those who may want to seek part-time work where there's not a large market for part-time work. This allows them flexibility to work on and off as much as they want, or based around other schedules that they may have. It's caused increased competition. Hotels and rental companies, brick and mortar stores have had to become more and more innovative and have had to find ways to reduce their costs in order to compete. It's provided certain economic and environmental efficiencies, such as based upon the ride-sharing economy, there's bound to be less cars on the road. There's less emissions, being exerted, through vehicles and other forms of transportation. And, office sharing is allowed for, less stress on bandwidth usage, power generation usage, and other factors that can flow into that field. It's also, based upon, the reduction in cars and people that are ride sharing, that reduces infrastructural deterioration and traffic congestion. It leads to less inebriated drivers on the road that could, decrease the probability of accidents and things of that nature. So there's many positive impacts.
And what about the negative impacts?
Well, as with all industries that grow so big, so fast, there are always going to be some unintended negative consequences that are bound to arise as well. And that has been an issue in this industry. For first, I'd like to talk about safety and security concerns. A lot of these entities, in order to enter into this area of business, you have to pass a background check as an Uber driver, or as an Airbnb host, or something of that nature. But a lot of people can pass a background check that may or may not be someone who you want to share a ride with or stay in their apartment. They are complete and total strangers in those cases. There are properties that are not subject to inspection and could have latent defects and unsafe aspects to them. There's a lot of cities that you can visit nowadays that, the personal injury law industry has now, has a new commercial out that advertise, have you been in a wreck in an Uber or a Lyft drive? Call me. There's a lot of issues in that. And then there's legal and tax compliance is a big issue. Industries such as this can be hard to identify in some ways. And, they shift the classification of taxation and sourcing based upon the different model of business that they're conducting. There's also concerns of fraud protection. There have been instances where people have posed as Uber and Lyft drivers or other types of shared riding entities, and criminal activities can ensue from that. There's certain people that operate short-term rentals that have their own websites, not just online, the large online platforms, and thus you're providing them with financial information, personal information on yourself that they could use for fraudulent purposes. Another very important factor are that within this industry, as it's still sad to say, somewhat in its infancy, wages are often very minimal. There's a very big lack of employee benefits, and oftentimes the people that may enter into this industry are those that have the greatest need for these. Not to mention, I'm sure at some point we've all seen pictures of how many boxes are out there and nowadays from Amazon and all the other online shipping companies. I often joke with my wife that I have a part-time job as a box cutter every day when I come home based upon the number of packages that are laying on my doorstep every day.
Those are great takeaways for everyone to think about, Jonathan, especially, I think the ones that are thought of less often are the minimal wages and lack of benefits, which certainly is a factor, and people certainly do need to be mindful when it comes to the safety and security concerns. So with the many, many positive and negative impacts for citizens, there must be a lot of impacts for local governments. Let's shift now and talk about how the sharing economy is affecting our local jurisdictions.
Sure. Well, while this is not by any means a all-encompassing comprehensive list that would address all of the impacts, these are some that we wanted to hone in on because they are major issues. When looking at the local governmental impacts, you're going to have issues that you're going to encounter with zoning compliance, people operating businesses in residential areas, municipal business license compliance, ad valorem taxes, appeasement of local competitors that are having to comply with laws, while others may be flying under the radar, regulatory compliance, there are health and safety risks, revenue sourcing, and tax simplifications, which are always of a vast importance to a local government.
And it's actually funny because the first time I learned about the term revenue sourcing was from you. You and I were having a conversation. Actually, it was about potholes of all things, and you explained to me how the big part of the problem was from the tax implications caused by the sharing economy and revenue sourcing. Can you share with the audience more about revenue sourcing and the tax implications?
Yes, that is always going to be a factor with this industry because of their business models and the change from brick and mortar stores to online entities and things of that nature, because governments cannot exist without taxation. The governments do not produce goods and service and generate revenue in and of themselves in most cases absent taxes. And the largest source of revenue for many governments are things such as sales taxes or property taxes. Take property. I mean, online entities don't pay property taxes for your local government, and this is a great example of a sales tax being converted to a rental tax based upon the shared economy. Say someone wanted to, they had a big event come up. They've got their high school reunion coming up. They want to go out and buy a very nice dress. Well, there's a local store, a brick and mortar store whereby they could go purchase a very nice gown for $439. That would be subjected to a sales tax at the location where the transfer of title occurred. That could generate, oftentimes sales taxes can be up to 10, 11%, and that could generate between the state, local, and county government, or state, municipal, and county government, that could generate up to $43. But now there are industries that actually offer the rental for a certain period of time of the exact same gown, whereby as opposed to a sales tax, in many cases, it would be subject to a rental tax, which could be sourced outside of your jurisdiction where the property is, where it's actually used, or where the customer's address is, as opposed to within your local community. Not to mention the impact of the amount of tax, if indeed your local government even has the authority to assess a rental tax at the local level. The price charged for this is going to, the taxable measure is going to be a lot lower, and the tax generation, whether it be within your local community or outside of it, is still at a lower level because it's a cheaper way to do it.
I love the dress example. Yeah. I've rented one myself before, saving hundreds of dollars, so I get it. Can you take us through the big picture view?
Yes, this is a kind of a broad overview of the many implications that this can have from everywhere from rental taxes to sales and use taxes to income and occupational taxes at the local level. You know, these food delivery services, whereas certain local communities used to be able to depend on their Home Depots, their grocery stores for a certain amount of guaranteed sales tax revenue that was consistent every year. You know, food delivery services and things like that from restaurants and grocery stores may be sourcing that transfer of title. Almost every state is a destination-based sales and use tax format as opposed to an origin-based. I think only 2 states that come to mind, maybe Arizona and Pennsylvania, are origin-based. But, you know, the transfer of title occurs outside of your jurisdiction. That's where the sales tax gets sourced. Same with occupational tax. If you're coming in as a TaskRabbit or a tackle, you know, person, you're probably not, you know, being subjected to an occupational tax at the local level. These are the funds that go towards sourcing all of the services that are provided by cities that make a community, such as, you know, water, police, fire protection, garbage services, ambulance services, police. This is what funds schools. It's what pays teacher salaries. Transit occupancy taxes can be shifted based upon this, based upon whether or not these entities are flying under the radar and not buying a business license, and whether or not they're collecting and paying lodgings or transit occupancy taxes or at the local level. So it can have a dramatic impact on the overall tax revenue for a single community depending on the level of activity within it.
That was a great explanation, Jonathan. Thank you. And now what we're all here to learn, how can local government agencies find the upside?
Well, the upside of this is that local governments have the ability to regulate business activities within their community pursuant to their police powers, thus giving them the ability to turn any of these negatives and positives or the negative impacts into positive impacts by creating revenue generating activities or being able to tax these activities and, you know, mitigating the negative impacts and competitive advantages and disadvantages in order to level the playing field. So governments, through their regulatory authority, can, you know, have different strategic tactics by which they do this. Regulatory and tax ordinances are, to me, the most effective means by which to do so. One of the most important things in doing this, if you're going to regulate a shared economy, you know, it's very important that public awareness be a part of it. Monitoring and enforcement, imposing criminal sanctions, things such as whistleblower laws, voluntary collection agreements have been on and off as a popular thing, even legal bans altogether. And we're going to go into these in more detail in the next few slides.
That sounds great, Jonathan. Thank you. And I'm hoping you're going to go over the pros and cons of each also.
Absolutely. First and foremost, my favorite is regulatory ordinances. The importance of this, the governments have the ability to regulate these industries. They can impose, criminal sanctions. Taxes have always been subject to civil and criminal penalties for noncompliance. But if you do so, one of the most important aspects, as I mentioned just a second ago, is make them known to the public. But posting notices of the need to comply. Having the local news programs or local papers run articles or notices, to make people aware of the need to comply and the potential penalties that they could be subject to for noncompliance. Mailing out notices to residential and commercial properties about, the need to comply and register and become a licensed permitted entity, whether you're Uber, whether you're Lyft, whether you're Airbnb, or whether you're, whatever industry you're in. And that's going to allow you to subject them to lodgings taxes, business licenses, other revenue generating taxes. One of my favorite examples is a city that we have worked with for many years in Palm Springs, California. They did this, and they did it very well. They obviously, it's a very attractive area for many reasons, and albeit a city of 50,000 residents, they passed laws to regulate the short-term rental industry because they had a serious problem with it, and hotels were suffering, and therefore they passed and publicized very well their regulatory measures in order to notify these short-term rental people that were engaging in those activities that they were required to purchase a permit and collect and pay the local transient occupancy tax. They now have over 1,600 permitted, licensed short-term rental providers, all of which are subject to audit, enforcement, monitoring, and it's a very large revenue-generating activity for them.
Can you share a couple of enforcement examples with us?
Yes, that's the next slide is two of my favorites, and I'm really going to focus on the Santa Monica, California, both of which are our Avenu clients. The 2016 measure that was affirmed by these are both regarding the short-term rental industry, by the way. And I'll go ahead because in 2016 the Northern District of California, the federal court there, upheld an ordinance imposed by the city and county of San Francisco on regulation of short-term rentals. And in 2018, actually, January 2018, Santa Monica passed an identical ordinance. The court ruled in favor of the government in 2016, but it was not as publicized because it was at the district level as opposed to an appellate level. But what Santa Monica did in their local ordinances is actually amended their criminal code to make it illegal for an online platform to list any host property within the city limits that was not licensed or permitted by the city. And they based this on negative impacts on home values and the quality and character of the neighborhoods being, based upon the level of short-term rentals that were going on. These laws required, and imposed an obligation upon these online platforms to cross-reference these entities and ensure that they were licensed and paying and known to the city before they were allowed to list them on their website. Well, of course, this led to litigation. It went back to the Northern District of California. The HomeAways and the Airbnbs sued the city of Santa Monica. Santa Monica won, again, in the same court as did the city and county of San Francisco. However, in this instance, they have the HomeAways and the SCR providers actually appealed to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and in June of 2019, the Court of Appeals affirmed that decision, and that was much more widely publicized based upon the level at which it reached, and they chose not to appeal it further, which gives a lot of sanctity to the fact that these are legitimate measures you can take.
And I'm going to guess that we're going to see more and more of that across the nation as time goes on.
One would hope. If done correctly, they are very effective.
So let's switch now and talk about an alternative measure that's not enforcement, and talk about voluntary collection agreements. What have you seen in this area, and what are the pros and cons to it?
Well, voluntary collection agreements were really, based upon my experience, were really pioneered for the most part by Airbnb. Whereby Airbnb would enter into an agreement with the local government, whereby they would agree to collect the transient occupancy taxes or the lodgings taxes at the local level and even the state level in many instances on behalf of their hosts. However, these agreements have a lot of limitations to them. That, for instance, based upon the contracts that hosts enter into with the online platform providers, they're not allowed to disclose any personally identifiable information, thus prohibiting the local government from being able to know who and exactly how many short-term rental providers are operating within their jurisdiction and where they're operating, whether it's zoned properly. So you don't get a whole lot of knowledge in it. There's also limited auditing provisions in there. Obviously, Airbnb and these entities can't enter into agreements that allow them to be subjected to be audited on behalf of their hosts. In every city, county, or state, or country in the world, they would just, they would endlessly be under audit. So they have provisions that do limit that capability, and there are easier ways to do it, and for the most part, not a lot of other companies were engaging in these or making these offers to local governments, and it was in some ways placing Airbnb at a competitive disadvantage for having done so. And in a lot of ways, there's been articles published that entering into these agreements ultimately, as opposed to a regulatory measure, will in the end run cost you revenue as opposed to gain revenue.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. And what about whistleblower laws? Have those been working out in different areas, or neighbors?
Whistleblower laws are one of my favorite. These are actually one of my favorite things, because we've actually assisted with the implementation of some of these in, Silicon Valley area, Northern California, various, beach locations, particularly, the Gulf Coast and a lot of vacation spots down there, whereby there's a lot of, retirement communities, condominiums, co-ops, neighborhoods that are not far from the beach and are listing as short-term rentals. And these are actually oftentimes, go to Naples. It's a quiet community for the most part. And then all of a sudden, if a college fraternity rents out the short-term rental to come down for spring break, or it disrupts the local residents and disrupts the quiet nature of the neighborhood. And just sometimes people don't want to exactly go and turn in their neighbor, but a whistleblower law that can protect the identity of who informs the local government, and offering a slight incentive to do so, whether it be $500, whether it be a certain fee or some other benefit, that may be the little encouragement that they needed to come forward and disclose these activities and make the local government aware of the need to regulate that location and those people.
Got it. Thank you. Now, this next one, I got to say, really surprised me. I was shocked to learn that some areas have actually established legal bans. What have you seen, and where have you seen this?
Well, actually, there's been all over the country, and there's been many communities that for years would not allow Uber or Lyft or entities such as that to purchase a business license because they didn't want it in their community. And but and then in some instances, a community is just, based upon how that community is designed, whether it be a rural community or a small community. There's no need for these types of services, and you don't want them in your particular seaside Florida or something like that. Does not want to have short-term rentals in their community, so they're going to issue an outright ban on it. But so the pros of that is you may appease some people, but there are cons as well. I mean, you can issuing a ban for on some of these convenient services can oftentimes lead to political unrest for those constituents that want access to those services and that have a need for those types of services. Not to mention, doing so can sometimes, if you don't allow for short-term rentals and the only option is your beach community or vacation attractive community is rental properties, not allowing Airbnb and other shared space online platforms to operate within your community may drive economic activity into the city next door. That does. Well, if I can stay for cheaper, 5 miles down the road and be on the same beach and have access to the same community and activities that are are in the city that banned it, then it may drive the economic activity down the road. So it can also impact, the ones who make these decisions are going to be the local governmental officials, and it can definitely lead to election implications on election platforms for local politicians. So, it's hard to appease everybody, but you have to be able to evaluate your need and want based upon your particular community.
Right, and I'm sure nobody wants to drive economic activity out of their area either. That's something to be mindful of. So, Jonathan, I am sure our audience members want to know what steps they can take for their jurisdiction. What does a roadmap look like?
Well, the first step that you would want to take in evaluating your needs in how you regulate the sharing economy is how large is the sharing economy in your community? Is it relevant? I mean, is your community large enough to where these activities are having an impact? So, basically do a cost-benefit analysis as to what would be the needs that these convenient services would supplement in your community, and what potential negative impacts could they have. So it's basically a cost-benefit analysis on whether or not your public constituents would have a need or want for these types of activities, and how much and how willing are you to regulate it. There's also safety and security factors. Are you seeing an increase in crime or other things based upon the shared economy or any type of any level of increase in the need for public services based upon these activities? That can obviously point to an obvious need for regulation. Obviously, as mentioned before, you're going to have to, based upon your particular community, there's going to be certain needs and wants. If you're a destination-based vacation community, you're going to want to attract as many visitors as possible if tourism is indeed your largest generating revenue generation entity. So there's certain levels of allowance that may lead you to want to allow certain services but not others. And there's also a level of competition factor that you're going to have to look at. Are you receiving complaints from your local hoteliers or bed and breakfast entities that are having to comply with all the local laws and that are purchasing business licenses and collecting and remitting taxes that can't necessarily compete with these short-term rentals or other people that are cab companies that can't compete with Uber and Lyft because they're flying under the radar and they're not complying. And that is going to be evidenced through tax implications or implications. If you start seeing a nosedive in your transient occupancy tax at the local level, obviously you may have a need you may have a problem with excessive underground short-term rental activity. Are your grocery stores and are your retail outlets, are you seeing a huge dip in local sales tax revenues based upon, online platforms and things of that nature? And so you have to consider based upon, oftentimes you can look at the revenues that are generated from certain taxes and identify where the needs are to implement regulation.
So in a nutshell, you're saying take stock of what your jurisdiction is doing currently and determine where it needs to go.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much. Now, I know I've seen a couple of questions pop up in our chat panel. We're going to move into our Q&A session. So anyone else who has questions for Jonathan while we've got him here and available, please just type your questions using the chat feature, and we will ask him live. So Jonathan, one of the first questions that came up was, what is the best way to start evaluating the size of the sharing economy in my area? How do I begin?
Well, that goes right back to the previous slide where I talked about the tax implications. That's going to be your most identifiable area in which you can determine which activities are ongoing, which types of revenue for the local government are being impacted, and at what level, and thus how much you need to address that type of activity. It's really a matter of evaluating trends in your economic and revenue generating taxes.
Okay. And this next one is, out of all the regulatory activities you have seen, which are the most effective?
Definitely, by far and away, the most effective have been the regulatory measures that impose, just as are always and often incorporated into noncompliance with tax laws, zoning laws, or otherwise, are going to be those that impose criminal and civil penalties for noncompliance, and the ability to make the public aware of those potential impacts on them. That public awareness is key in that regard, because if they're aware that they're operating an illegal type of business, and there are whistleblower laws in effect that allow people to remain anonymous and report them for it, then it's going to have an impact.
All right, thank you. And all right, we have one just popped up. What is the best way to tell if a specific city is being adversely affected by the misuse or abuse of short-term residential rental platforms, and what variables would measure and provide insight into this undesirable practice? Great question.
It's going to be your TOT tax revenue, or your lodging tax revenue, or hotel tax revenue, however it's termed in your particular jurisdiction. If you, like I said, if you start seeing a nosedive in those types of activities, there's obviously going to be either compliance issues. There's so many different manners in which there's a lot of entities such as Travelocity and Hotels.com that engage with local hoteliers to book rooms, and the way that they interact and the revenue and how they transfer revenue between each other can very much impact the amount of gross receipts that are subject to the local levy of lodging tax. There's also, if you just start seeing an absolute nosedive in your transient occupancy tax or lodging tax, then you very well may have a problem with excessive short-term rentals that are flying under the radar, unlicensed, and not compliant with your local taxes.
All right. And we have time for one last question. Our city imposes a hospitality tax on hotels, inns, and motels. In addition, there's a state and/or local sales tax. How do we ensure non-discrimination against owners if we do not impose an equivalent tax on Airbnb or comparable so-called sharing providers?
Well, there really would be no way to avoid that. I mean, they're equal. You know, those entities are in the same industry and subject to the same local tax levies, and thus, you know, providing penalties for non-compliance within your ordinance structure is going to put that liability on those that are non-compliant. It's not, if you enact a law, enact a tax, I mean, require those entities to obtain a permit or a license to operate, and thus you know about them, and if they don't comply with those laws, then the onus is on them and not you as a local government.
Got it. Thank you. And Jonathan, a couple more questions I want to squeeze in. I'm sorry, they just keep popping up, and I missed this one. What federal bills are coming through the pipeline which will regulate and or mitigate the negative effects of the sharing economy?
Well, there's always been rumors of a federal law that would come out regarding the economic nexus provisions. It's very much a patchwork framework throughout the nation between the states as to what economic nexus provisions have been passed and how they have been implemented. They are very inconsistent throughout the country and thus create in some instances, especially based upon the application of a number of transactions, it's very easy for someone to generate 100 transactions that may or may not even exceed the monetary threshold of $250,000 or whatever the state set it at, and have to comply with all sorts of state laws and monitor these activities. And they may just be a small business, for instance, they sell hats or something or T-shirts that somebody ordered 100 T-shirts, and all of a sudden you're subject to a collection of local sellers use tax or state and local sellers use tax. So there's always been rumors of federal bills that would regulate that. I haven't seen any of them that have grown immediate legs, but at some point, I think once, I haven't seen a lot of litigation ensue as of yet nationwide, but if it does begin to do so based upon the need to comply with various and economic nexus provisions throughout the country, I definitely would foresee the federal government having to step in that regard. I haven't heard of any other federal regulations regarding the sharing goods industry or the sharing spaces or the mobility. I have not heard any winds of laws on those yet.
All right, thank you.
As they continue to grow and expand, I think there may be.
All right, thank you. And then one more if we have time, and I think we can squeeze this in. Can you speak to how rural communities should approach the sharing economy?
Well, basically, yes. I mean, go down the list. I mean, evaluate what is the size of the sharing economy in your jurisdiction? Is it, what level of sharing economy and what types of sharing economies would exist in your local community based upon the nature of it? Is it going to be grocery deliveries because you don't have a lot of brick and mortar stores? Is it going to be, the need for ride sharing because you have an enormous amount of traffic congestion or just other for other various reasons? Are you seeing, a dip in certain types of tax revenues in your rural community that could be attributable to the sharing economy? And that would give you a good idea of what is causing the negative impacts, if there are any. And, it also, just based upon the evaluation of your community overall, you should know what types of needs does your community have that would make life more convenient for your constituents.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jonathan, for your time and sharing your expertise and insight with everyone here today. We really, really appreciate it. And for those of you interested in learning where your jurisdiction currently stands, Avenu is offering a free assessment on regulating the sharing economy for our audience members today. Just send us an email and contact us at succeed@avenuinsights.com. We'd love to hear from you, and we would love to connect. So that wraps up our presentation for today, and I thank everyone for taking time out of your schedule and joining us. And thank you, Jonathan.
As always, very welcome.